One of the things I noticed in your bio, Rachel, is that you actually were born and raised in Joliet, Illinois. You came back to that area, and you say that you grew up with two working class parents. So the first thing that jumped into my mind is to ask you what they did.
Okay. Well, for a short period of my life, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was a bridge tender. And then when I was in second grade, my mom went to college and became a teacher. And so by the time I was in middle school, she was teaching as a substitute in my school, which you can imagine the kids were like, "Is that your mom? Is that your mom?" But I was fortunate to have her home when I was very young. And then, like many kids in the 80s, we were latchkey kids. We came home from school and parents were finishing their work schedules, and they would come home at 4 or 5 o'clock, and we would been home and had to take care of ourselves for a couple hours.
Yes, I was a latchkey kid myself, an earlier version of the latchkey generation. So I relate to that, having had two parents who worked very hard and we had to take care of ourselves. So before I move on, how did it feel at school for you when kids said, "Hey, is that your mom? Is that your mom?" Was that a good thing or were you embarrassed?
At first it was a good thing, but as in junior high, kids can be rough. And so I started to quickly decipher that this was probably not the best thing that they wanted to know if that was my mother. And so after a couple of visits, I was like, "Mom, aren't there other schools you could go and substitute at?" And within that next year, she actually got full-time employment. So that was the last year that she had to substitute.
And through your parents, you mentioned again on your website that you learned the value of unions. And first, were they members of unions, both of them?
Oh yeah, my dad had been an auto worker up in Michigan when he was like in his 20s, and then he went on to become a janitor, and he formed Valley View's union here locally. And then he went on. He was in politics for a little bit and served on the Will County Board where I currently serve. And when he left that, he that's when he became a bridge tender and was a Teamster with 179. Now, my mom, she had worked for Ask Me 2000 and sat on some of the first talks of public aid in the state. And then when she was a teacher, she was with AFT.
Hmm. Since you mentioned this on your website that you're a very strong supporter of unions, and especially you point out your support for the Employee Free Choice Act, what is it that unions do, both in your personal experience and then obviously for your community, that you think is so important in terms of both strengthening, supporting the labor movement?
Yeah, I mean, my parents talked about unions mostly with my grandfather, who was also a union worker. He worked here at the prisons, and then he was a deputy sheriff. And a lot of times he would talk about things made in America and how we have to buy things made in America. When I was a little kid, I didn't understand why Grandpa was so mad about things being made in China. I was like, "What's wrong with China?" Because they would just give these one-liners without really deciphering, what all of that meant. And so I would hear them talk about that as a kid growing up about the importance of unions and things made here in the United States. But it really wasn't until I was well into my 30s that I started to see the economics of what they meant by that. But locally, I mean, my parents had talked about organizing for workers' rights. We learned about that both in school, but then at home. My mom, being a teacher, she always reinforced that at the house, what that meant. And so the prevailing wage, the 8-hour workday, which we don't even have an 8-hour workday now, it's a 40-hour work week. Holidays, things like that. My parents made sure that we knew that that came from unions. And reading books like The Jungle, it was very eye opening in the fact that the experiences I had is, well, why didn't people just quit? Why didn't they? And obviously, there was a fictional book, but it showed what was happening at the time of people. They couldn't just quit, right? They would have these horrible working conditions and they would have to go to work still because there was no other options. And so, obviously, unions working together, that collaboration of everyone saying, no, together we need this or we're not going to work, that can shut down a factory. When one person decides, well, I'm not going to work, I'll just try and find employment elsewhere, and there is no other employment, then that person's just ruined their life essentially. So for me, that was a lesson that was told over and over again as a kid growing up, that the importance of standing together with your community, with your family, making sure that together we have a voice. I mean, my dad was a politician, so he understood the importance of voting and the power of the people. And I think that's a message that in my generation definitely had been lost. We became very complacent. I'm 38 years old, grew up in the 80s, and it was, oh, somebody else is doing that job and they're doing a good job at it, so we can just sit back. Especially, in the when the internet bubble happened and people in Silicon Valley were making hand over fist, the stock market was going up. The message that was sent to us as young adults is, oh, yes, the world's great. You don't have to worry about anything. And I think that affected whether or not people voted or not. And now we're seeing the fallout of that. And I still at the doors, I knock a lot of doors in my campaign, and people are still, oh, yeah, I don't vote. I don't really see the importance of it. And it's so shocking to me that that is still uh, an appetite that is out there. And how can we change that? The younger generation and the older generation, I feel like they had things to fight for, right? You've got your older generation who came off of World War II and their parents and the important message they were sending. And now you've got this younger generation fighting for our climate and a sustainable future and the economics of it, like the student loans that they're facing. But this middle generation that I belong to, there's a lot of apathy where it's like, we don't really need to vote. And it's very frustrating.
Do you think the apathy comes from looking at the political scene and just seeing it as kind of a swamp that isn't worth diving into? Or do you think that actually they don't think there is anything to change, that life is so good, or maybe it's a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both, with the fact that they don't believe their vote matters. Because, like, my parents told me this collective action, right? We grew up thinking unions could do this. Even my Girl Scout group could have a collection action to do something, and that was a message that was constantly brought forward. The voters together have the power to change things. But I'm not sure how many other people of my generation receive that message, that together, yet you singly, maybe you can't do anything, but when you are working with everybody around you and we're all doing this, if 52% of the people out there are not voting, that's the majority. That those 52% have the power to change stuff. So I think some of it is, there's a lot of people who are comfortable right now. They don't see the writing on the wall. They don't understand that, if they're standing on a mountainside and part of the cliff gives out and they're like, well, my part of the cliff is still standing here, I'm okay. That if they don't shore up that side of the mountain cliff, then they're next, And so that false sense of security that I'm okay, someone else is taking care of me, as opposed to, hey, let's not let that mountainside fall in first. For those first few people, let's help them out too, and make sure that everybody has a stable environment to move forward in. And so, yeah, the combination of they're comfortable, the combination of they feel like their voice doesn't matter, and absolutely, people are sick of what is happening in our country. When they have voted and they've gotten politicians both on the right and left side of the aisle who have been bought and paid for by wealthy donors, they feel like, what does it matter? It doesn't matter which side I vote in, because the same thing happens and nothing ever changes.
And do you see that when you're knocking at the doors? I noted that both when you ran for the Will County seat that you served in and currently in the campaign, you like knocking on doors and you like that one-on-one voter contact. Do you see a difference in the generational response to someone of your age running for Congress? Do people say, oh, good on you? Or is it sort of, hey, why are you doing this? Do something more fun with your life?
Yeah, it's been a real change over the last few years. The response I'm getting to the doors now are people are telling me, great, we need young people in office, right? So it's a very positive feeling. But when I first ran, I ran in 2017 for a city election, and people asked me at the door, are you even old enough to run for office? And so I don't look that much different in the 3 years.
Well,
but
that's a compliment, right? You like that, and you say, "Oh, yes, I am."
Yeah, absolutely. But that goes to show you. I mean, maybe it's the fact that it's a local race versus a congressional race. But a lot of things have also changed with some of the new members in Congress. People are looking for new ideas. Maybe, like I said, they're sick of the status quo and they're looking for something different and they're hoping that maybe young people have a different view on it. We do, by the way, have a different view on where we should get our messaging from. And for me, it's not about the high end donors and the wealthy few in this country. It is about serving the people and the everyday Americans. And I look at my family and my neighbors, my friends. We're not represented. I knock doors, and people don't feel represented by their government.
Hmm. So tell us a little bit about your district. I've never been to Joliet, but I've traveled in Illinois a little bit. So I'm trying to get a sense of who lives in your district and what do you think you would say is the most interesting or specific thing that is important about the district?
Yeah, so we have the second and third largest cities in Illinois. That's Aurora and Joliet, Illinois. And then I also have large portions of Bolingbrook and Naperville. Joliet and Aurora are working class areas. Usually, both parents or both members of the household are working your 40-hour, your traditional work week or longer. And then Bolingbrook and Naperville have a lot more investment, business, so it's a little bit more affluent of an area. We do have several universities throughout the area, so there's definitely innovation and room for growth. There's a little bit of agriculture in my area. Will County has a fair bit of agriculture, but my district kind of cuts around some of that. But I would say one of the most important things about this district is it's right for the Green New Deal. I would say this is ground zero. We've got refineries here. We've got coal ash that needs to be cleaned up that's leaching into our water. We do have some issues with our agriculture, making sure that we can grow food here. We've got all kinds of pollutant cleanups. We've got the largest inland ports in the world. And so our air pollution it's horrible. And we've got diesel 2.5 particulate matter that it's smaller than most pollutants, so it can go into your airwaves. So our asthma rates are trending at 8% higher over the last 6 years. So really, when we're looking at cleaning up our environment, this is a great area to do so. And on the Will County Board, I've been fighting for our contracts, our government contracts, to be 100% renewable energy, which I believe will help generate jobs here for wind, solar, hydropower. And this is a fight I'm continuing to take on. We've got one of our lowest prices of energy right now because of some of the federal and state incentives. So the difference between the contract we have today and one at 100% renewable energy is $8,700 over 3 years. So that's nothing when you compare the price to generate jobs and renewable energy. So this is stuff that we're going to keep fighting. Unfortunately, we don't have all the votes we need at the county level. But when I look at what the state is trying to push right now, they're pushing what's called CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act. And some of that is to help offset these coal plants that are closing, and how do we deal with that tax hole that happens? How do we deal with families who are losing entire towns of families who are losing their jobs and their income, and transition to better jobs, higher paying jobs, cleaner jobs. And so the state's trying to pass CEJA, which in my version, in my opinion, is a smaller version of the Green New Deal, and we need to pass this for the whole country. So if not here, where? I mean, we have every aspect of what we're looking at. And then we do have a diverse makeup of people who live here. We have 30% Hispanic, we have 20% African American, I've got 8% Asian. And so it's a nice little melting pot of what we see, a little microcosm of what we see in the rest of the country.
Now, you mentioned the Green New Deal, which many of us obviously support, and then you connected that to new jobs in the potential green industries. And I just want to point out and get your take on this, that when I hear that from environmentalists about high wage jobs, new jobs in this industry, I actually ponder the fact that actually these jobs are roundly not union. Most of these jobs, if you look at building wind turbines and other jobs like that, there are very few jobs that, first of all, are high paying. And this industry right now, at least, is almost entirely not union.
Right. So, and that's been one of my frustrations too. So, what I've asked ASME and IBEW to come in and speak to the Democrats about how these jobs could become union jobs and why it's important for us to push for them, to push for that prevailing wage and how that stabilizes the rest of the wages in the state. And for the Green New Deal, by pushing that, it talks about unionizing labor across the United States, regardless of right to work states. And that's what we need. When we got less than 10% unions left in this country, we're not protecting workers any longer. We're not protecting, and even at our highest, it was like 35, 40%. But by having that percentage of workers who were getting paid a living wage, who had benefits, whether it's pensions or health care, this allowed the rest of the business to have to compete with that. And it stabilized our workforce. It stabilized our economy. We need to get back to that. And then we can do that by cleaning up our climate.
hmm Since you mentioned healthcare, I thought we talked briefly about that issue. You are a strong supporter of Medicare for all. And a little bit of this may be from your own experience working as an actuary in the health insurance industry. Tell us a little bit about what you learned working in the industry. And did that inform your passion for Medicare for all at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent 4 years working as an actuary. I have my first degree is in mathematics, and I set premiums. I looked at networks. I decided whether a hospital or doctor could be in a network or not based on their rates. And one of the things I learned was our prices on healthcare vary substantially. So in one area, they might charge $500 for an MRI and $50 in another area. It's the same machine, it's the same work. Why is that? Because they can, right? That zip code generates more money, so therefore they're going to charge more money. And that's a problem, especially when you look at rural hospitals. They've had to take different hospitals out of networks because they were charging too much because maybe not as many people went to them because they had to drive further. So then in the long run, if it's not in the network, then that hurt the hospital even more because people couldn't get there or they couldn't afford it. And so then that ends up closing those hospitals down, which means large areas of rural populations did not have access to care. They might have to drive an hour or two now to get to a hospital that would be in network or something that was still open. So insurances could definitely dictate the type of businesses that we had out there. We already know from a personal standpoint that insurance dictates care over doctors, which was very frustrating. But I started off by setting up managed care for HMO type networks. I left that to go work for life insurance, thinking that it was going to be a little bit better, and I found it to be worse, in my opinion. We would look at any time there was a potential to lose money, then the company would stop selling that product. They would find ways to move people off of those products onto other products they were guaranteed to make money on. Now, I get the aspect of, you don't want your company to go bankrupt, but it got to the point that every policy, we would try and find some reason to cancel those policies and get them off so we never had to pay out, right? So if you were 30 days late, you might have had a policy from your whole life. But in 1989, we found where you were 30 days late on a payment and now the person just passed, and they would go back, instead of paying out, they would refund the money from 1989 to now and say, well, really your policy ended at this date, and so we're going to refund this money and not pay out the health benefit or the death benefit. So there were things like that I just found appalling. So after working in that industry, I really felt like I was going to work every day and selling pieces of my soul away for somebody else to make billions of dollars. And I worked for the third largest life insurance company in the world. And so my mom couldn't understand when I first told her I'm done being an actuary. She's like, why? You're so young. You're making good money. It's such a stable job. It did have a pension to be vested into. And I was like, I just can't do this work anymore. And so I had started working with animals at the wildlife way station just to try to help heal myself. I ended up going back to school and getting a biology degree. Fast forward several years, I was a military spouse for 10 years, and I started to notice how great, their insurance is. It's TRICARE for the families and newly retired. It's a little bit different than what the veterans are on currently, but TRICARE is a system. It's much like a universal healthcare system that they pay in a payroll deductible, and then you go to doctors and nurses, and then they pay out the care. The government sets the rate, so they have to accept the government rate for if I go to the doctor and they want to charge $300, but the government rate says it's $100 across the board. then that's all they can charge me. And so we would get these bills of $0, $0, $0. And then when I left my marriage, I went to the marketplace and looked at ACA, and my kids are covered by TRICARE. They remained covered, and so I had no issue about taking them to the doctor and any care that they need. But when I went to get on my insurance, it was going to be $13,000, and I'm a single mom. I'm relatively healthy, and that just was not something that I could afford. It's more than $1,000 a month just for me to have health care. So I went 2 years without it. I did pay the tax penalties of $1,200. And I prayed I didn't get sick. I did a lot of home remedies during those years. But what frustrated me is that knowing millions of Americans are on this universal health care, right? Millions of Americans are on Medicare right now. And so we already set these rates. And with TRICARE, they set the pharmaceutical rates as well. So why is it that we can do this for these groups of people, but we can't do it for everyone? It's not a cost factor anymore. We know how to pay for it. I mean, we've set the payroll deductibles for these groups. We've set the limiting rates of what doctors and hospitals can charge. So that exasperated my frustration of why have we not passed Medicare for all. So in February of this year, when I went and spoke with my current congressman about passing Medicare for all, signing on to the JPL bill that's in the House, and he was not, he asked a lot of questions, and we played a lot of trying to meet with him over and over again to try and answer these questions, to pull him along, only to find out the whole time he wasn't interested in that. He thinks that ACA is a fine system and we need to stick with that. It was very infuriating. It was the first step to me running this race.
So the last question I'll ask you, since I usually avoid talking about who you're running against because I want the time to be spent on you and your issues, you are running a primary challenge against a person who opposes, or at least has not signed on to Medicare for All or the Green New Deal. He actually also refuses to co-sponsor a bill to lower the price of drugs. And you actually are running it in a congressional district that is relatively progressive. Bernie Sanders won that district by about 5% in the 2016 primary when he ran against Hillary Clinton. And my main question is, have you gotten any kind of guff? And I am asking this probably knowing the answer, from the Democratic establishment, basically saying, oh my God, we have to focus on Republicans and so on. Why are you running this primary race at this time? And at the same time, what do voters say to you about this primary race?
Yeah, absolutely. As soon as I jumped in the race, there was a lot of that. Oh, you got to wait your time. Why would you focus on a Democratic race when there's Republicans out there? And we're in a D+9 district, so there isn't Republicans right now. They're coming after the seat. I'm sure there will be someone who files, but not to say anyone's in a with the voters decide, but we're in a relatively safe district. So that was very frustrating. But then on top of that, our county chair association told chairs of the different counties that they needed to endorse the incumbents, that that's their policy. They went as so far as to have, several members go ahead and endorse them. Now, we found out because there were some chairs who said, hey, we're not going to endorse the incumbents. We're going to let our PCs and our voters decide for themselves. So kudos to those chair members. And then, of course, we've been denied access to the voter software that the Democratic Party uses. So we had to go find a third-party vendor, raise the funds to pay for it. So, yeah, there's a lot of fighting against the party. This is our democracy. When we have primaries, it holds our elected officials accountable. So these are the things that we want to have. We want to have choice. And it also helps people turn out to the polls. When there's more representation on that ballot, the more likelihood is somebody's going to show up because they feel that their voice can be represented by one of those people on the ballot. So we absolutely want to have primaries. And then the voters, though, have a little bit different view. When we're knocking on the doors, we're getting probably three responses. One of them is they don't know who their current elected officials are, and that happens a lot. And so they're happy to see a new face. They're happy that someone's knocked on their door. They'll tell me things like, well, I've lived here for 20 years, and no politician has ever knocked on my door. And that's a little sad to me. The other thing we're getting is we are getting progressives and people who are sick of the system who are good for you. We're excited, and that feels really good. The smallest percentage we're getting are people who know my opponent, and we're not getting a lot of strong people who are for the opponent, so that's been good. Now we've got a lot more doors to knock, but the overall feeling is that people are ready for a change. They're looking for something different, and they're glad that someone is showing up at the door willing to talk to them.